What if I told you that a 17-year-old peasant girl who couldn't read or write convinced a king to give her an army and then led one of the most shocking military victories in medieval history? What if I told you this same girl claimed she spoke directly to saints and angels, and that her enemies were so terrified of her, they eventually burned her alive as a witch? Today we're diving deep into one of history's most extraordinary stories, the tale of Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orleans in 1429. This isn't just another medieval battle story. This is about how one person's unshakable belief changed the course of nations, inspired millions, and created a legend that still captivates us 600 years later. But here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story. When you hear about Joan's visions, her impossible rise to power, and her military genius, ask yourself this: in our modern world, would we listen to someone like Joan, or would we dismiss her as delusional? And what does that say about us? But here's what I want you to think about as we go through this story. When you hear about Joan's visions, her impossible rise to power, and her military genius, ask yourself this: in our modern world, would we listen to someone like Joan, or would we dismiss her as delusional? And what does that say about us? To understand why Joan's story is so incredible, we need to step back into the nightmare that was medieval France in 1429. Picture this: your country has been at war for nearly a century. The 100 Years' War had been devastating France since 1337, and by Joan's time, things looked hopeless. The English didn't just want to conquer France, they claimed to be the rightful rulers of France. King Henry IV of England had achieved stunning victories, including the legendary Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen decimated French knights. The English controlled most of northern France, including Paris itself. But here's where it gets really dark for the French. Their rightful king, Charles VII, hadn't even been crowned yet. He was still just the Dauphin, the heir apparent, hiding in his castle while his kingdom crumbled around him. Many of his own nobles had given up hope and switched sides to the English. Now imagine you're living in Orleans in 1428. This city wasn't just any city, it was the key to everything. Orleans controlled the Loire River, the gateway to southern France. If Orleans fell, the English would control the entire north, and Charles VII's claim to the throne would be finished forever. Think about this for a moment. How would you feel watching your world collapse around you? Would you fight on against impossible odds? Or would you surrender to what seemed inevitable? This is the world Joan of Arc was born into, and somehow, incredibly, she chose to fight. Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc as she was actually called, came from Domremy, a tiny village on the border between French and English-controlled territory. Her father was a peasant farmer. In medieval times, that meant Joan was nobody. She couldn't read, couldn't write, and had never traveled more than a few miles from her home. But here's where her story becomes truly extraordinary. Starting around age 13, Joan claimed she began receiving visions from the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. These weren't just dreams. Joan described them as crystal-clear conversations, where these holy figures gave her a mission that would change history. Now, I want you to really think about this. What would you do if your teenage daughter came to you and said she was talking to angels? In our modern world, we'd probably be concerned about her mental health. But Joan's conviction was so absolute, so unwavering, that somehow she convinced not just her family, but eventually the future king of France himself. The saints told Joan three things. First, to drive the English out of France. Second, to get Charles VII crowned as the rightful king. And third, to liberate Orleans. Remember, this is a peasant girl who had never held a weapon, never seen a real battle, and lived in a world where women had virtually no power. But Joan didn't see obstacles. She saw destiny. In 1429, she convinced a local garrison commander to give her an escort to meet the Dauphin. Think about how impossible this sounds. It would be like a teenager from rural Iowa today demanding a meeting with the president because angels told her to save America. When Joan finally met Charles VII, something remarkable happened. In a room full of nobles, Charles had disguised himself to test her. Joan walked straight to him and said, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." She had never seen him before, yet she identified him instantly. What happened next changed everything. Joan somehow convinced this desperate, defeated man to give her armor, a banner, and most incredibly, military command. Can you imagine the desperation Charles must have felt to trust his kingdom to a teenage peasant girl? But Joan's certainty was infectious, and her timing was perfect. Orleans was about to fall. Let me paint you a picture of Orleans in early 1429. This wasn't just a siege, it was a slow strangulation that had been going on for months. The English had built a ring of fortresses around the city called Bastille. These weren't just military outposts, they were designed to cut off all supply lines and starve the city into submission. Inside Orleans, people were dying, food was running out, disease was spreading, and hope was evaporating. The French garrison was demoralized and outnumbered. Many soldiers were talking about surrender. The city's leaders were preparing for the inevitable, total defeat and English occupation. But think about what this really meant for ordinary people. Imagine you're a mother in Orleans, watching your children grow thinner each day. Imagine you're a merchant who's lost everything, or a soldier who's watched your friends die in futile attempts to break the siege. The psychological weight of impending doom was crushing the entire population. Then on April 29, 1429, something unprecedented happened. A 17-year-old girl in white armor rode into the city carrying a banner that read, "Jesus Mary." This was Joan of Arc, and her arrival changed everything instantly. Now here's what I find fascinating about human psychology. Joan's presence alone began to transform the situation before she fought a single battle. The soldiers who had been ready to surrender suddenly found new courage. The citizens who had been preparing for defeat started talking about victory. But Joan didn't just inspire people with words. She completely revolutionized how they approached the siege. Traditional medieval warfare was slow, cautious, and formal. Armies would position themselves carefully, negotiate, and sometimes avoid direct confrontation for months. Joan threw all of that out the window. She looked at the English fortifications and essentially said, "We're going to attack them directly and we're going to win." Her military advisors thought she was insane. Frontal assaults against fortified positions were considered suicide in medieval warfare. But Joan had something her enemies didn't expect: absolute conviction and a completely different approach to leadership. Instead of commanding from behind the lines like nobles traditionally did, Joan fought alongside her soldiers. She shared their dangers, their hardships, and their victories. What happened next still amazes military historians today. On May 4th, 1429, Joan led her first assault against the English Bastille called Les Tourelles. This wasn't just any fortress, it was the strongest English position, the key to their entire siege strategy. Joan's approach was revolutionary. Instead of the typical medieval tactic of surrounding and starving out a fortress, she ordered direct, aggressive attacks. But here's the crucial part. She didn't just send her soldiers to die. Joan fought at the front of every charge, carrying her banner and shouting encouragement. Think about the psychology of this moment. English soldiers who had been dominating French forces for decades suddenly faced an enemy who showed no fear, no hesitation, and no doubt. Joan's presence on the battlefield was like nothing they had ever encountered. During the assault on Les Tourelles, Joan was struck by an English crossbow bolt that pierced her shoulder, going straight through her body. Any normal commander would have retreated. Most would have been carried off the battlefield. But Joan pulled out the bolt herself, said a quick prayer, and immediately returned to the fight. Can you imagine the effect this had on both armies? Her own soldiers saw their leader wounded but unbroken, while the English began to wonder if they were fighting someone supernatural. The attack succeeded. Les Tourelles fell, and with it, the entire English siege collapsed. But here's what makes this victory even more remarkable. It wasn't just about military tactics. Joan had fundamentally changed how her soldiers thought about themselves and their enemy. For the first time in decades, French soldiers believed they could beat the English. Joan had broken not just the siege of Orleans, but the psychological dominance that had paralyzed French resistance for generations. Now I want you to consider something profound about leadership and belief. Joan succeeded not because she had superior weapons or more soldiers, but because she had something more powerful: unshakable faith in her mission and the ability to share that faith with others. In our modern world, we often dismiss the power of belief as superstition, but Joan's story shows us something important about human nature. Sometimes believing in something impossible is the first step to making it possible. The English retreat from Orleans wasn't just a military defeat, it was a complete psychological collapse. Soldiers who had considered themselves invincible were suddenly terrified of a teenage girl who claimed to speak with angels. The victory at Orleans didn't just save one city, it transformed the entire Hundred Years' War. Within weeks, Joan had led Charles VII to Reims Cathedral, where he was finally crowned King of France. This wasn't just ceremony, it was the moment France truly became France again. But I want you to think about something deeper here. Joan's success raises profound questions about leadership, faith, and social change that are still relevant today. How does one person, especially someone from the margins of society, spark a movement that changes history? Joan's story challenges our modern assumptions about expertise and authority. She had no military training, no political connections, no formal education. Yet she outmaneuvered experienced generals and convinced a king to follow her lead. What does this tell us about the sources of real power and influence? In our current world, where we often feel powerless against large institutions and systemic problems, Joan's example is both inspiring and troubling. Inspiring because it shows that individuals can change history. Troubling because it raises questions about how we evaluate claims of divine guidance or revolutionary ideas. Think about social movements today, whether it's climate activism, civil rights, or political reform. Many of these movements are led by young people who, like Joan, are dismissed by established authorities as naive or unrealistic. Joan's story forces us to ask, when should we listen to voices from the margins, and when should we be skeptical? Joan's military success also had immediate practical consequences that shaped European history. The English never recovered their momentum in France. Within 24 years, they had lost almost all their French territories. The Hundred Years' War, which had seemed destined to end in English victory, instead ended with French triumph. But perhaps most importantly, Joan created something that hadn't existed before: French national identity. Before Joan, people thought of themselves as subjects of local lords or members of the Catholic Church. Joan helped create the idea of France as a unified nation with its own destiny and divine purpose. This concept of nationalism that Joan helped birth would go on to reshape all of Europe and eventually the entire world. The modern nation-state system, the idea that people should govern themselves based on shared identity and culture, these concepts trace back to movements like Joan's. Of course, Joan's story doesn't have a fairy tale ending, and this teaches us something crucial about the price of challenging established power. In 1430, Joan was captured by English allies and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Think about this for a moment. The English couldn't defeat Joan militarily, so they had to destroy her through their legal and religious institutions. They understood that Joan's power came from her claim to divine authority, so they had to prove she was actually in league with the devil. The trial was a sham, designed to discredit Joan and break French morale. But even facing torture and death, Joan never renounced her visions or her mission. She was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, at age 19. Here's what I find remarkable about Joan's final days. She maintained her convictions even when it cost her everything. In our modern world, we often compromise our beliefs for comfort, convenience, or social acceptance. Joan faced the ultimate test of faith and didn't flinch. But the English plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking French resistance, Joan's martyrdom only strengthened it. She became more powerful in death than she had been in life, a symbol of French independence and divine justice that inspired resistance for generations. 25 years later, the Catholic Church reversed Joan's conviction and declared her a martyr. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. The girl who had been burned as a heretic became one of history's most revered religious figures. So what can we learn from Joan of Arc's story in our modern world? I think her legacy challenges us in several important ways. First, Joan forces us to examine our assumptions about who can be a leader and where good ideas come from. In our credential-obsessed society, we often dismiss people who lack formal qualifications. But Joan shows us that sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected sources. Second, Joan's story raises difficult questions about faith and reason. She succeeded because of beliefs that many modern people would consider delusional. This doesn't mean we should accept every claim of divine inspiration, but it does suggest we should be cautious about dismissing the power of deeply held convictions. Third, Joan demonstrates the importance of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She faced challenges that seemed impossible: military defeat, social prejudice, political opposition, and ultimately death itself. Yet she never wavered in her commitment to her mission. In our current moment, when many people feel powerless against large-scale problems like climate change, political corruption, or social inequality, Joan's example is both inspiring and instructive. She shows us that individuals can change history, but only if they are willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. Finally, Joan's story reminds us that the most important battles are often psychological and spiritual, not just political or military. She won at Orleans not just by defeating English soldiers, but by transforming how French people thought about themselves and their possibilities. As you think about Joan's incredible journey from peasant girl to national hero to martyred saint, I want to leave you with this question. What would you be willing to sacrifice for your deepest convictions? And in our skeptical, secular age, how do we distinguish between dangerous fanaticism and the kind of faith that can change the world? Joan of Arc's story doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us something more valuable. A reminder that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they combine unshakable conviction with the courage to act. What do you think? Could someone like Joan emerge in our modern world? Or have we become too cynical to follow a teenage visionary? Let me know in the comments below, and if this story inspired you to think differently about faith, leadership, or the power of individuals to change history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into medieval history. Next week, we'll explore another incredible story from the Middle Ages, the rise and fall of the Knights Templar and the conspiracy that destroyed them. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.